Today we're going to be talking about tests for parallelograms, okay? Or in other words, how can I tell if I'm given a shape, is this shape a parallelogram or not? You're going to notice that today's lesson is going to cover a lot of things that sound a whole lot like what we covered in 6-2, okay? Because there are a lot of overlaps there. So our first way that we can tell, or our first test, is going to be if both pairs of opposite sides of a quadrilateral are congruent, okay? So if both pairs, and that's really important, of opposite sides are congruent, then you have a parallelogram. Okay? So then it is a parallelogram. And remember, our symbol for parallelogram is like a slanted rectangle, right? So that's our first test. So what they're saying is, if I were to be given a shape, okay, and it says this side and this side are congruent, and this side and this side are congruent, then without knowing anything else about that shape, I already know I have a parallelogram. Okay? Remember, they may mark those as congruent with tick marks. They might say, you know, both sides measurements are 5x. They might tell you something else, but just knowing that, you would know this shape is a parallelogram. Okay, so let's look at test number 2. Okay, test number 2 says if both pairs of opposite angles are congruent, then it's a parallelogram. And keep in mind, all of these are also predicated on the fact that it has to be a four-sided figure. If you don't have a quadrilateral, then there's no way it's a parallelogram. Okay, so that's kind of our first test, in case you were wondering about that one, because otherwise we don't have opposite sides and parallel opposite sides and all of that. It's really difficult to achieve with different numbers of sides. So when we're talking about parallelograms, they have to be quadrilaterals. Then, if you know that both pairs of opposite angles, okay, so it'd be like this angle and this angle, and this angle and this angle, if those are all congruent, then you would know that you have a parallelogram. Okay, let's look at test number 3. Okay, test number 3 says if you have a quadrilateral and its diagonals bisect each other, okay, so you have this, and we've got our diagonals are marked on here, and I can tell that diagonal has been cut in half, and this diagonal has been cut in half. Then I know I have a parallelogram. Okay, let's take a look at test number 4. Okay, test number 4 says if it's a quadrilateral and one pair, and that's really important here, because we're just talking about one pair of opposite sides are parallel and congruent. So that's the second key. They have to be parallel and congruent, not just one or the other. Then you're going to know it's a parallelogram. So let's take a look here. So that means if I know this side and this side are both parallel, and I know that they're both congruent, then I don't have to know anything else about that figure. I know that it is a parallelogram. And the way that that works, just in case you're wondering, is if these two lines are parallel, what that's actually also telling me is that if I measure from one point to another point on that line, and I do that, you know, over here also, I actually know that those have to be the same distance, right? So from, let's give it a name, L, M, and O. So from M to L here has to be the same distance as from N to O, because otherwise MN and LO would not be parallel lines. Okay, so that's just one of the fun facts about parallelograms. Okay, so how might you be asked to use this? All right, so you might be asked, first of all, you know, they might give you a shape, and they might say, okay, can you prove that this shape is a parallelogram? And they might ask you to justify your answer. So you would say, yes, I can verify that RSTQ is a parallelogram, and I know that because my opposite angles are congruent, and that was one of our tests for is it a parallelogram. Okay. And so that would be, yes, you can, and then you justify your answer. Sometimes they're not going to give you enough information. So instead of giving you this, they might give you something like this, right? So we know that R and T are congruent, but we don't know that S and Q are congruent. And so you would say, no, none of the tests that we learned are valid for this parallelogram, and so it would not work out. Okay, I can't prove whether it's a parallelogram or not. You might be given something like this, okay, and you might be asked with no other information labeled, is this a parallelogram? And your answer would be no, okay, because it is not a quadrilateral. Not a quadrilateral. So that one's a really nice, easy one. Okay. Other things you might be asked for, they might draw you a shape, and they might give you algebraic expressions for, you know, two angles here or something. And they might say, find x so that this is a parallelogram. And all that means is you have to remember, okay, in order for this to pass the test for a parallelogram, with information I've been given, my opposite angles have to be congruent. So I would go and I would set my angles, my opposite angles, that's this one here and this one here, I would set them equal to each other, and then I would solve for x. Okay? And remember that the solving for x, that part is your algebra from last year, and so if you have any trouble with that, please come see me in 0 hour, because I really want to be sure you know how to solve those problems, but sometimes I know that that's going to take a little bit more time than we have in class, okay? Second of all, you're going to notice that some of these answers, like this one, you might end up with a fraction, and that's okay. It might be a mixed number, it might be a whole number. You can give those either as a fraction or as a decimal. You just have to pay attention to the way that they ask the question in Schoology, right? So we'll work some other examples in class tomorrow, and I really appreciate you listening, and I will see you tomorrow. Thank you. Goodbye.